Marcus Chen had grown accustomed to being the punchline of conversations he never started. When the registered mail arrived on that gray Tuesday morning, informing him that he'd inherited St. Helena's medical center from a great uncle he'd never met, the laughter from his neighbors was so loud it could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Here was a man who couldn't afford to fix the leak in his apartment ceiling, suddenly the owner of a crumbling hospital that had been abandoned for over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Marcus himself. But sometimes fate has a peculiar sense of humor, and what appears to be life's cruelest joke can become its greatest gift. What Marcus would discover in the depths of that forgotten medical facility would prove that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the rust and decay to see the possibilities underneath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The eviction notice had been taped to Marcus Chen's apartment door for 3 days before he finally worked up the courage to read it. 30 days to vacate. The words blurred together as he stared at them, his 7-year-old daughter Lily tugging at his sleeve with questions about breakfast that he couldn't answer because the refrigerator had been empty since yesterday. The morning sun filtered through their cracked window, highlighting the water stains on the ceiling that had grown larger with each passing month, creating abstract patterns that Lily sometimes pointed to during their evening stories, pretending they were clouds or animals or anything more hopeful than evidence of their deteriorating circumstances. Marcus folded the notice carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, where it joined the growing collection of overdue bills, final warnings, and apologetic letters to creditors who had long since stopped believing his promises. The jacket itself was a remnant from better times, a charcoal gray blazer he'd worn to job interviews before the industry downsizing that had turned experienced software engineers into expendable statistics. Now it served primarily as a shield against both the weather and the pitying looks from neighbors who whispered about the single father who'd fallen so far from grace. The apartment building's hallway smelled of cooking spices and industrial cleaner, a combination that had once seemed welcoming but now only reminded Marcus of how little he belonged anywhere anymore. Mrs. Nguyen from 4B emerged from her door carrying garbage bags, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away with the practiced indifference of someone who'd learned not to get too attached to neighbors who might disappear in the middle of the night. The building had seen plenty of those disappearances lately, families vanishing like morning mist when the rent became too much to bear. Lily's school backpack was missing a zipper, held together with safety pins that caught the hallway light like tiny beacons of improvisation. She decorated it with drawings made from crayons borrowed from her classroom, creating a masterpiece of childhood optimism that somehow made Marcus's chest ache with both pride and worry. Her teacher had mentioned during their last conference that Lily was remarkably resilient for a child who'd experienced so much change, but Marcus knew resilience was just another word for a 7-year-old learning to carry burdens that should have been his alone. The walk to Lily's school took them through neighborhoods where gentrification and decay existed in uncomfortable proximity, past coffee shops that charged more for a single drink than Marcus had budgeted for groceries, and playground equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum of urban neglect. Lily chatted about her upcoming science project, something involving plants and sunlight that required materials Marcus wasn't sure he could afford. Her enthusiasm was infectious despite his circumstances, and he found himself making mental notes about library books they could check out, ways to make magic happen with household items and determination. They paused at the crosswalk near the school, waiting for the light to change, while Lily pointed out interesting cloud formations with the authority of someone who'd made a serious study of meteorology. A group of other parents stood nearby, their conversations floating past like fragments of a life Marcus could barely remember living, discussions of weekend soccer tournaments and piano lessons and summer camps that existed in a parallel universe where money wasn't a constant source of anxiety. One mother glanced at them, her gaze taking in Lily's patched backpack and Marcus's worn shoes with the kind of casual assessment that spoke volumes about the invisible boundaries that separated their worlds. The school building itself was a testament to institutional optimism, its brick facade weathered but welcoming, with colorful murals painted by students who'd long since graduated and moved on to lives Marcus hoped would be easier than his own. Lily hugged him goodbye with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned that goodbyes sometimes lasted longer than expected, her small arms wrapping around his waist with a strength that belied her size. She whispered something about loving him that got caught in the morning wind, but Marcus heard it anyway, carrying those words with him as he watched her disappear through the school's front doors. The bus ride back to his neighborhood cost $2.50, money that would have bought a can of soup or a loaf of bread if he'd chosen differently. But the alternative was a 2-hour walk that would have consumed most of his morning, leaving him less time for the job applications that had become his full-time occupation. The other passengers were a mixture of shift workers heading home, elderly residents traveling to medical appointments, and people like himself who'd learned to navigate the city's public transportation system with the efficiency born of necessity. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister Helena, who lived across the country with her veterinarian husband and their 2 children in a house with a swimming pool and a 2-car garage. Her messages always began with expressions of concern and ended with carefully worded suggestions about moving closer to family, as if 3,000 miles and the cost of relocation were minor inconveniences rather than insurmountable obstacles. Helena meant well, but her good intentions were wrapped in the kind of privilege that made her forget how far Marcus had fallen from the life they'd both once taken for granted. The apartment building's mailboxes were located in a cramped alcove that smelled perpetually of dampness and disappointment. Marcus's box was number 237, its lock sticking slightly as he turned the key, revealing the usual collection of advertisements for credit cards he'd never qualify for and services he couldn't afford. But tucked between a grocery store circular and an overdue utility notice was an envelope that made him pause. Heavy cream-colored paper with his name written in formal script, the return address listing a law firm he'd never heard of in a city he'd never visited. The elevator was broken again, forcing him to climb 4 flights of stairs while his mind raced through possibilities, most of them involving debts he'd forgotten, or legal troubles he couldn't afford to address. The envelope felt substantial in his hands, the kind of correspondence that suggested either very good news or very bad news, with little middle ground between those extremes. By the time he reached his floor, his heart was beating faster than the climb warranted, anxiety mixing with curiosity in proportions that made his hands shake slightly as he unlocked his apartment door. The letter inside was written on matching stationery, its language formal and precise in the way that legal documents always seem designed to obscure meaning rather than clarify it. But certain phrases jumped out with startling clarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Inheritance. St. Helena's Medical Center. Sole beneficiary. Marcus Chen, a great-uncle Marcus had never met, but who had apparently remembered a nephew he'd never seen in a will that transferred ownership of an entire hospital. The words swam together as Marcus read them once, twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of information that seemed to belong in someone else's life. The phone number at the bottom of the letter connected him to a secretary whose voice suggested she'd delivered this type of news before, though perhaps never to someone who responded with such prolonged silence. Yes, the inheritance was legitimate. No, there were no outstanding debts or liens against the property. Yes, Marcus was now the legal owner of a 40-bed medical facility that had been closed for 12 years. The secretary's tone remained professionally neutral as she explained that the building was located in Millbrook Valley, about 2 hours north of the city, and that arrangements could be made for him to inspect the property at his convenience. Marcus hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen chair, staring at the letter while his coffee grew cold in its chipped mug. The eviction notice crinkled in his pocket as he shifted position, a reminder of his current circumstances that made the inheritance seem even more surreal. He owned a hospital. The same man who'd been stealing packets of sugar from fast food restaurants to sweeten his coffee now possessed an entire medical facility. The irony was so complete it bordered on cosmic comedy. The internet search he conducted on his ancient laptop revealed images of St. Helena's Medical Center that looked like something from a horror movie. Broken windows, overgrown grounds, graffiti covering walls that had once housed healing and hope. Local news articles described it as an eyesore, a blight on the community that no one seemed interested in addressing. The comment sections were filled with suggestions about demolition and redevelopment, neighbors complaining about property values and safety concerns. Not one person seemed to see any potential in the abandoned structure. When Lily came home from school that afternoon, Marcus was still sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed articles and legal documents that told the story of his unexpected inheritance. She dumped her backpack by the door and approached him with the cautious expression of a child who'd learned to read adult moods with uncomfortable accuracy. Her questions were simple and direct in the way that children's questions always cut straight to the heart of things. Did this mean they wouldn't have to move? Could they live in a hospital? Would there be doctors there to help people? Marcus gathered the papers into a neat stack and pulled Lily onto his lap, explaining the situation in terms that a 7-year-old could understand, while trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. They had inherited a building, but it was old and empty and needed a lot of work. They wouldn't be moving there immediately, but maybe, possibly, eventually it could become something useful again. Lily listened with the intense concentration she brought to all important conversations, asking follow-up questions that revealed she'd already begun imagining possibilities that hadn't occurred to Marcus. The evening news was playing in the background while they shared a dinner of canned soup and crackers, the familiar rhythm of headlines and weather reports creating a backdrop for their quiet meal. But Marcus found himself distracted by thoughts of Millbrook Valley and the abandoned hospital that now belonged to him. What did one do with an inherited medical facility? The lawyers had mentioned that he could sell the property, though they'd been vague about potential market value and interested buyers. The building itself might be worthless, but the land could have value to developers willing to clear the site and start fresh. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams that mixed his current anxieties with impossible scenarios involving the hospital. He saw himself walking through pristine corridors filled with state-of-the-art equipment, but when he tried to touch anything, it crumbled to dust in his hands. Other dreams featured Lily running through endless hospital hallways, her laughter echoing off walls that stretched impossibly high, while Marcus searched frantically for exits that kept disappearing just as he reached them. The next morning brought another letter, this one from the property management company that had been maintaining minimal security at St. Helena's Medical Center since its closure. They were requesting instructions about continued services, payment for outstanding fees, and clarification about Marcus's intentions for the property. The tone was politely professional, but underlying questions were clear. Was he planning to demolish, renovate, or simply abandon the building like so many other inherited properties that became community problems? Marcus made his decision while standing in his kitchen, looking out the window at a view that consisted primarily of other apartment buildings and a slice of sky barely wide enough to determine the weather. He would drive to Millbrook Valley that weekend and see the hospital for himself. Not because he had any particular plan for the property, but because making decisions about things he'd never seen felt like another form of giving up. If he was going to inherit someone else's abandoned dreams, he owed it to himself and to Lily to at least understand what those dreams had once looked like. The announcement of his plans prompted reactions that ranged from Helena's worried phone calls to Mrs. Nguyen's concerned questions about leaving Lily alone in the building while he was away. But his neighbor from down the hall, a retired teacher named Dorothy Thompson, offered to watch Lily for the day, claiming she enjoyed the company and could use help with a jigsaw puzzle that had been defeating her for weeks. The arrangement felt like a small miracle in a life that had grown accustomed to problems without solutions. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything look like it was filmed through a dirty window. Marcus borrowed a car from Jerome, a former co-worker who'd managed to avoid the company layoffs and maintained the generous spirit of someone whose luck was still holding. The vehicle was older than Marcus's apartment lease, but reliable enough for highway driving. Its radio stuck on a classical music station that provided an oddly elegant soundtrack for his journey into uncertainty. The drive to Millbrook Valley took him through countryside that gradually transitioned from urban sprawl to genuine rural landscapes, farmland punctuated by small towns that looked like they'd been designed as postcards from a simpler era. Gas stations with hand-painted signs, diners advertising home-cooked meals, antique shops housed in buildings that were probably antiques themselves. It was the kind of scenery that suggested life moved at a different pace here, governed by seasons and weather rather than stock prices and quarterly reports. The GPS guided him off the main highway onto smaller roads that wound through hills covered in trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. Mailboxes marked the entrances to properties he couldn't see from the road, hidden behind gates and gravel driveways that disappeared into green tunnels of overhanging branches. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, without the constant background scent of exhaust and urban decay that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing it. Millbrook Valley itself turned out to be one of those towns that probably looked exactly the same as it had 50 years ago, with a main street lined by businesses that suggested a community where people still knew each other's names and shopping was done at places owned by families rather than corporations. The hardware store's windows displayed tools arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for museum exhibits, while the barbershop's spinning pole turned with hypnotic regularity, advertising services that probably hadn't changed in generations. The hospital sat on a hill overlooking the town, its presence impossible to ignore, despite being hidden behind a fence topped with warning signs about trespassing and safety hazards. From the road, St. Helena's Medical Center looked like a monument to abandoned ambitions, its Art Deco facade still showing traces of former grandeur beneath the accumulated neglect of more than a decade. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown, nature reclaiming asphalt with the patient persistence of weeds and wild grasses that had found ways to thrive in the most unlikely places. Marcus parked outside the main gate and sat in the borrowed car for several minutes, studying the building that now belonged to him and trying to reconcile its current condition with the legal documents that declared him its owner. The structure was larger than he'd expected, sprawling across the hilltop like a small city devoted entirely to the business of healing. Even in its current state, something about its design suggested optimism, as if the architects had believed that building something beautiful would somehow make the work done inside it more meaningful. The key the lawyers had provided opened the main gate with surprising ease, its mechanism well maintained despite the building's obvious abandonment. Marcus walked up the circular driveway that had once welcomed ambulances and visitors, now decorated with puddles that reflected the gray sky like scattered mirrors. The main entrance was secured with multiple locks, but the same key ring provided access to doors that opened onto a lobby that took his breath away. Despite years of neglect, the hospital's interior retained an elegance that spoke of an era when medical facilities were designed to inspire confidence rather than merely function efficiently. The lobby ceiling soared 2 stories high, decorated with murals that depicted scenes of healing and hope, their colors faded but still visible beneath the dust and water damage. A reception desk curved gracefully along one wall, its marble surface dulled but unbroken, while elevator doors bore brass fixtures that would have been beautiful when polished. Marcus's footsteps echoed through corridors that stretched in multiple directions, each hallway lined with doors that opened onto rooms frozen in time. Patient rooms still contained beds, some stripped of linens while others remained made up as if waiting for occupants who would never arrive. Stations retained their built-in cabinetry, surfaces covered with papers and equipment that suggested the hospital's closure had been sudden rather than gradual. It was like exploring a ship that had been abandoned at sea, everything left exactly as it was when the last person walked away. The elevator still functioned, carrying him to upper floors that revealed the hospital's full scope. Administrative offices with windows that offered panoramic views of the valley below, conference rooms where important decisions had once been made, and medical suites that had housed specialized equipment and procedures. Each floor told part of the story of a medical facility that had clearly been more than just a small-town hospital, its size and sophistication suggesting it had served a much larger community than Millbrook Valley could have provided on its own. But it was in the basement that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. The lower level housed mechanical systems, storage areas, and what appeared to be a series of sealed rooms marked with warning signs about authorized personnel only. His inherited keys opened these doors as well, revealing spaces that made him catch his breath in amazement. Room after room of medical equipment, still in original packaging, some pieces covered with protective sheets that had kept them pristine despite the years of abandonment. Surgical equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, diagnostic machines whose purposes Marcus could only guess at, and devices that bore price tags indicating values that seemed impossible for a small-town hospital to afford. The equipment wasn't old or outdated. Some pieces appeared to be cutting-edge technology that would be considered advanced, even by current standards. Serial numbers and documentation suggested these were prototypes, experimental devices, and limited production machines that represented millions of dollars in research and development. As Marcus explored deeper into the basement storage areas, the scope of the discovery became overwhelming. Entire rooms filled with surgical robots, imaging equipment, and diagnostic devices that looked like they'd been designed for a medical facility 20 years in the future. The documentation he found suggested that St. Helena's had been participating in some kind of advanced medical research program, serving as a testing ground for experimental treatments and revolutionary equipment before its sudden closure. One room contained nothing but computers and servers, their cases sealed and apparently never opened. Another held what appeared to be a complete laboratory setup, with equipment for genetic analysis and pharmaceutical research that looked like it belonged in a major university or corporate research facility. The basement was essentially a warehouse of medical innovation, millions of dollars worth of equipment stored and forgotten in the depths of an abandoned hospital. The implications hit Marcus gradually as he walked through room after room of pristine equipment. This wasn't just an inherited building. It was a treasure trove that could potentially solve every financial problem he'd ever faced. But it was also something more complex than a simple windfall. The equipment represented research, innovation, and healing potential that was being wasted while stored in these forgotten basement rooms. Medical facilities around the world were probably struggling to afford the kind of technology that was gathering dust beneath his feet. By the time Marcus emerged from the basement, the afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds, streaming through the hospital's windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. He walked back through the corridors with new eyes, seeing not an abandoned building but a facility that could potentially be restored to serve its original purpose. The equipment in the basement could fund such a restoration and still leave enough resources to secure Lily's future and his own. The drive back to the city passed in a blur of planning and possibility. Marcus's mind raced through scenarios that seemed too good to be true, but the images of the basement storage rooms were burned into his memory with perfect clarity. He'd need to research the equipment more thoroughly, determine its current market value, and figure out the legal implications of selling medical devices that had apparently been part of some kind of research program. But for the first time in months, he felt something that had become foreign to his daily experience: hope. Lily was waiting for him when he returned to their apartment, her eyes bright with curiosity about his adventure. She listened with rapt attention as he described the hospital, though he kept his explanation focused on the building itself rather than the valuable discovery in its basement. There would be time later to discuss how their lives might change. For now, it was enough to see her excitement about the possibility that they might not have to leave their neighborhood after all. That night, Marcus lay awake making mental lists of everything that needed to be done. He would need to research the medical equipment market, find appraisers who specialized in advanced technology, and probably hire lawyers who understood the complexities of selling research equipment. But beneath all the practical considerations was a growing sense that his inheritance represented more than just financial salvation. It was an opportunity to restore something valuable to a community that had lost it, to take abandoned dreams and give them new life. The eviction notice was still in his jacket pocket, but it no longer felt like a countdown to disaster. Instead, it had become a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how what appeared to be an ending could actually be the beginning of something unprecedented. Marcus Chen, the software engineer who'd lost everything, was about to become the owner of medical equipment worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. But more importantly, he was about to discover that some inheritances come with responsibilities as well as opportunities, and that the most valuable treasures are often the ones that require courage to fully claim. The abandoned hospital on the hill had been waiting for someone to recognize its potential, and Marcus was beginning to understand that he might be exactly the person it had been waiting for. The laughter from his neighbors would continue for a while longer, but soon they would be talking about Marcus Chen for entirely different reasons. The poor single father who'd inherited a medical center as a joke was about to prove that sometimes the universe's sense of humor involves making the impossible suddenly, miraculously possible. As dawn approached, Marcus found himself thinking about Elias Chen, the great-uncle he'd never met, who had somehow known that his nephew would need exactly this opportunity at exactly this moment. Perhaps some gifts take generations to reach their intended recipients, traveling through time and circumstance until they arrive precisely when they're needed most. And perhaps recognizing such gifts requires nothing more than the willingness to look beyond surface appearances and see the possibilities that others have missed. The abandoned hospital held secrets that would soon transform not just Marcus's life, but the entire community of Millbrook Valley. But first, he needed to figure out how to turn a building full of forgotten medical miracles into a future that his daughter would be proud to inherit. The real adventure was just beginning, and Marcus Chen was finally ready to discover what lay beyond the laughter and disbelief of people who had never learned to see potential in the most unlikely places. The phone call came at 6:30 Monday morning, jarring Marcus from dreams filled with sterile corridors and gleaming medical equipment. Dr. Sarah Winters identified herself as the former chief of staff at St. Helena's Medical Center, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen even before their first cup of coffee. She had heard through professional networks that someone had inherited the facility, and she needed to speak with him immediately about matters that couldn't be discussed over the phone. Marcus found himself agreeing to meet her at a coffee shop in Millbrook Valley that afternoon, even though the drive would consume most of his day and gas money he couldn't really spare. Something in Dr. Winters' tone suggested this conversation would be worth the expense, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was the way she'd paused when he mentioned his name, as if connecting pieces of a puzzle she'd been working on for years. The coffee shop turned out to be the kind of place where locals gathered to discuss weather and politics with equal intensity, its walls decorated with photographs of Millbrook Valley's history dating back to its founding. Dr. Winters was easy to spot among the farmers and retirees, her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested decades of early morning surgeries, her clothes practical but expensive in the way that spoke of professional success. She stood when Marcus approached, extending a hand that felt surprisingly strong for someone who appeared to be in her 70s. They settled into a corner booth that provided privacy from the other patrons, though Marcus noticed how several people nodded respectfully to Dr. Winters as they passed. She was clearly someone who commanded respect in this community, which made her interest in him all the more intriguing. She ordered black coffee and waited until Marcus had settled with his own drink before speaking, her words measured and careful, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. The story she told transformed Marcus's understanding of his inheritance completely. St. Helena's Medical Center hadn't been just a small-town hospital when it closed 12 years ago. It had been the secret headquarters of a revolutionary medical research consortium, a collaboration between several major pharmaceutical companies and technology firms that had chosen the remote location specifically to avoid attention from competitors and regulatory agencies. The hospital had served as both a testing ground for experimental procedures and a development center for medical equipment that was decades ahead of anything available to the general public. Dr. Winters had been recruited to lead the project because of her reputation for innovative surgical techniques and her ability to manage complex research protocols. For 5 years, St. Helena's had functioned as a normal hospital during the day, while conducting groundbreaking research during evening and weekend hours. The equipment Marcus had discovered in the basement represented the culmination of that research, prototypes, and limited production devices that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. The project had ended abruptly when one of the pharmaceutical partners had been acquired by a larger corporation that decided to consolidate all research activities at their existing facilities. The equipment had been left behind because moving it would have required extensive documentation and regulatory approval that the new corporate owners weren't willing to pursue. Rather than deal with the complicated logistics of relocating experimental medical devices, they had simply walked away, sealing the basement storage areas and assuming someone else would eventually handle the disposition of the equipment. Marcus Chen had been one of the project's primary investors, a venture capitalist who had believed in the consortium's vision of revolutionizing medical care through technological innovation. When the project was abandoned, he had quietly purchased the entire facility and its contents, planning to eventually restart the research program under different management. But his death had come before he could implement those plans, leaving the hospital and its treasures to a nephew he'd chosen specifically because Marcus's background in technology would help him understand the value of what he'd inherited. Dr. Winters leaned forward across the table, her eyes intense with an urgency that made Marcus's pulse quicken. The equipment in that basement wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It represented medical breakthroughs that could save thousands of lives if properly utilized. Surgical robots that could perform procedures with precision no human surgeon could match. Diagnostic devices that could detect diseases years before current technology. And treatment systems that could revolutionize how medical care was delivered in underserved communities. But there was also danger in possessing such advanced technology without understanding its implications. Several governments and corporations would be very interested in acquiring the equipment, not necessarily through legal means. The research consortium had been careful to keep the project secret precisely because the technology could be weaponized or used in ways that violated international agreements about medical research. Dr. Winters had spent 12 years worrying about what would happen if the equipment fell into the wrong hands. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what he was hearing. He had inherited not just a building and some valuable equipment, but the culmination of a secret research project that had implications far beyond his ability to comprehend. The basement storage rooms weren't just filled with medical devices. They contained the future of healthcare, locked away and forgotten, while people around the world suffered from diseases that this technology could potentially cure. Dr. Winters reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing documentation that she'd preserved from the research project. Patents, technical specifications, and test results that proved the equipment's capabilities and established its legitimate ownership. She had been waiting for someone to inherit the facility who would be capable of understanding what they possessed and making responsible decisions about its use. Marcus's background in software engineering, combined with his obvious need for financial security, made him an ideal candidate to restore the research program under proper oversight. The proposal she outlined was both exciting and terrifying in its scope. Dr. Winters wanted to help Marcus reactivate St. Helena's Medical Center as a legitimate research hospital, using the abandoned equipment to provide cutting-edge medical care while continuing the development work that had been interrupted by corporate politics. She had maintained relationships with researchers and medical professionals who would be eager to participate in such a project, and she knew funding sources that would support innovative healthcare delivery in underserved rural communities. But the project would require Marcus to commit completely to the restoration effort, moving to Millbrook Valley and dedicating himself to learning enough about medical technology to serve as the facility's administrator. It would mean uprooting Lily from her school and friends, leaving behind the familiar urban environment for a small town where everyone would know their business. The financial rewards could be enormous, but the personal costs would be significant as well. Marcus asked about the legal implications of selling the equipment instead of using it, wondering if he could simply liquidate his inheritance and use the proceeds to build a more conventional life for himself and Lily. Dr. Winters' expression grew grave as she explained the complications that would arise from such an approach. Much of the equipment was still technically experimental, requiring special licenses and certifications to transfer ownership. The patents were held by corporations that had long since been acquired by other companies, creating a legal maze that could take years to navigate. More importantly, she continued, the equipment had been designed to work as an integrated system, with devices that complemented and enhanced each other's capabilities. Selling individual pieces would destroy much of their value, while depriving the world of medical advances that could benefit millions of people. The technology represented a complete ecosystem of healthcare innovation that was far more valuable when kept together than when broken apart and sold to the highest bidders. The afternoon stretched into evening as Dr. Winters shared stories of the research that had been conducted at St. Helena's during its secret years. Cancer treatments that had achieved remission rates far beyond current standards, surgical procedures that had repaired damage previously thought to be irreversible, and diagnostic capabilities that had identified genetic disorders before symptoms appeared. The hospital had been quietly revolutionizing medicine while appearing to be nothing more than a small-town medical facility serving a rural community. She showed Marcus photographs of the research team that had worked at the hospital, doctors and scientists who had sacrificed lucrative careers at prestigious institutions to participate in work they believed could change the world. Many of them were still practicing medicine, though none had found opportunities to continue the kind of innovative research they had pursued at St. Helena's. The medical establishment was often resistant to rapid change, preferring incremental improvements to revolutionary breakthroughs that might disrupt existing power structures. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Dr. Winters made one final offer that left Marcus speechless. She would provide the medical expertise and professional connections necessary to restart the hospital if he would provide the commitment and oversight needed to make the project successful. She had spent 12 years planning for this opportunity, maintaining relationships, and developing strategies that could transform St. Helena's into a model for future healthcare delivery. All she needed was someone with the vision and determination to make it happen. The drive back to the city passed in a blur of possibilities and concerns that seemed to multiply with every mile. Marcus found himself imagining Lily attending school in Millbrook Valley, making friends in a community where neighbors knew each other's names and children could play outside without constant supervision. But he also worried about the isolation, the distance from Helena and other family members, and the enormous responsibility of managing a project that could affect thousands of lives. Lily was waiting for him when he returned to their apartment, her homework spread across the kitchen table like evidence of a life that suddenly seemed both precious and temporary. She looked up from her math problems with the bright smile that never failed to remind him why every sacrifice was worthwhile, and Marcus felt his resolve crystallizing around a decision he hadn't realized he was making. Whatever risks were involved in Dr. Winter's proposal, they couldn't be greater than the risk of remaining trapped in their current circumstances. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Marcus sat at his computer researching everything he could find about medical technology patents, experimental equipment regulations, and the legal framework governing research hospitals. The information was complex and often contradictory, but certain facts emerged with clarity. The equipment in St. Helena's basement was indeed extraordinarily valuable, but its value could only be fully realized through careful, legitimate use rather than quick liquidation. He found references to the original research consortium in medical journals and technology publications, though always described in vague terms that suggested the authors knew more than they were willing to reveal. The few details that had been made public indicated that the project had achieved breakthrough results in multiple areas of medical research before being discontinued for strategic business reasons that were never fully explained. The more Marcus learned, the more he understood that Dr. Winters had been telling him the truth about both the equipment's potential and the complications involved in possessing it. He had inherited something that was simultaneously a treasure and a burden, an opportunity that came with responsibilities he was only beginning to comprehend. The abandoned hospital on the hill wasn't just a building filled with valuable equipment. It was a sleeping giant that could awaken to transform healthcare for millions of people. But reactivating such a facility would require more than just good intentions and valuable equipment. It would need regulatory approval, medical staff, ongoing funding, and a level of expertise that Marcus currently lacked. The learning curve would be steep, and the margin for error would be minimal when dealing with experimental medical technology and human lives. Yet the alternative was to let revolutionary medical advances continue gathering dust while people suffered from conditions that this equipment could potentially treat. Marcus made his decision while standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the city lights that had once represented opportunity but now felt like barriers to a different kind of future. He would call Dr. Winters in the morning and accept her proposal, committing himself and Lily to a complete transformation of their lives. The abandoned hospital would be restored, the forgotten equipment would be put to use serving people who needed advanced medical care, and Marcus Chen would become something he'd never imagined, the administrator of a cutting-edge medical research facility. The next morning brought a flurry of phone calls that set everything in motion. Dr. Winters had already begun reaching out to her network of medical professionals, regulatory contacts, and potential funding sources. The response was more enthusiastic than Marcus had dared to hope, with researchers expressing eagerness to participate in a project that would allow them to work with technology they'd only read about in theoretical papers. But enthusiasm from the medical community was balanced by skepticism from regulatory agencies that would need to approve the hospital's reactivation. The equipment would require extensive testing and certification before it could be used to treat patients, a process that could take months or even years, depending on how thoroughly the authorities decided to examine the technology. Marcus found himself learning an entirely new vocabulary of medical regulations, research protocols, and safety standards that governed experimental healthcare delivery. The legal complications were equally complex, involving patent rights, corporate ownership transfers, and international agreements about medical technology sharing. Marcus hired a specialized law firm recommended by Dr. Winters, attorneys who had experience with medical research projects and understood the unique challenges involved in reactivating abandoned facilities. The legal fees were substantial, but they represented an investment in ensuring that everything was done properly from the beginning. Meanwhile, practical considerations demanded immediate attention. The hospital building itself needed extensive renovation before it could safely house patients or research activities. Electrical systems required updating, plumbing needed repairs, and safety equipment had to be installed to meet current standards. Marcus found himself becoming an expert in construction management as well as medical technology, coordinating with contractors who were amazed by the scope of the restoration project. Lily adapted to the changes with the resilience that had carried her through previous disruptions in their lives. She listened to Marcus's explanations about their upcoming move with serious attention, asking practical questions about her new school and whether she could still visit Helena during summer vacations. Her concerns were focused on maintaining connections with people she cared about rather than worrying about the enormous changes that lay ahead. The apartment hunting process revealed another dimension of their transformation. Marcus found himself looking at houses in Millbrook Valley, properties with yards and gardens that seemed impossibly luxurious after years of urban apartment living. Dr. Winters helped him identify a colonial-style house within walking distance of the hospital, its previous owners having been a retired couple who had maintained it meticulously before moving to assisted living. The house purchase negotiations proceeded smoothly once the sellers learned that Marcus was planning to restore the hospital, a project that would benefit the entire community. Property values in Millbrook Valley had suffered when St. Helena's closed, and the prospect of the facility reopening generated excitement among residents who remembered when the hospital had been a source of both employment and pride for the town. As the restoration project gained momentum, Marcus found himself at the center of a community effort that extended far beyond the hospital walls. Local businesses offered services at reduced rates, understanding that the project's success would benefit everyone in the area. Construction workers competed for positions on the restoration team, eager to participate in work that would restore their community's most important institution. The equipment evaluation process revealed treasures that exceeded even Dr. Winters' expectations. Some devices had been prototypes that were never put into production, making them unique in the world of medical technology. Others represented improvements to existing equipment that could revolutionize standard procedures if properly implemented. The basement storage areas yielded new discoveries almost daily, as if the research consortium had hidden capabilities even from themselves. But the most significant discovery came when Dr. Winters found sealed laboratory reports that documented successful treatments for conditions that current medicine considered incurable. The research team had achieved breakthrough results in treating degenerative neurological diseases, certain types of cancer, and genetic disorders that typically carried terminal prognoses. The treatments had been tested and proven effective, but the results had never been published because the research program ended before the findings could be peer-reviewed and approved for general use. These reports represented more than just valuable intellectual property. They contained information that could save lives immediately if properly applied. Dr. Winters began reaching out to colleagues at major medical centers, sharing carefully selected portions of the research data with specialists who could verify its accuracy and help determine how quickly the treatments could be made available to patients. The response was overwhelming, with researchers expressing amazement at breakthrough results that surpassed anything currently available. The regulatory approval process accelerated once government agencies understood the scope of the medical advances that had been locked away at St. Helena's. What had initially appeared to be a routine application to reactivate a closed hospital became a priority project when officials realized they were dealing with technology that could significantly advance American medical capabilities. Special committees were formed to expedite the review process while ensuring that all safety standards were rigorously maintained. Marcus found himself traveling frequently between Millbrook Valley and various government offices, meetings with regulatory agencies, and conferences with medical professionals who were eager to participate in the restored hospital's programs. His software engineering background proved invaluable in understanding the computerized systems that controlled much of the advanced equipment, while his experience managing complex projects helped him coordinate the multiple streams of activity required to bring the facility back to life. The media attention began gradually, with local newspapers covering the hospital restoration as a human interest story about a community reclaiming its medical center. But as word spread about the advanced technology involved, larger publications began taking notice. Medical journals requested interviews with Dr. Winters, technology magazines wanted to examine the equipment, and healthcare policy experts sought information about the implications of the project for future medical delivery systems. Marcus learned to navigate media interviews with the same careful attention to detail that he applied to regulatory compliance. The story of his inheritance captured public imagination, but he was careful to emphasize the collaborative nature of the restoration effort and the potential benefits for patients rather than dwelling on the personal financial implications. The project was bigger than his individual circumstances, and he wanted coverage to focus on the medical advances rather than the human drama. The first major milestone came when regulatory agencies granted preliminary approval for the hospital to begin operations as a research facility, with patient treatment to be added once additional safety certifications were completed. Dr. Winters had assembled a team of medical professionals who were eager to begin working with the advanced equipment, and the first research protocols were scheduled to begin within weeks of receiving final approval. But success brought new challenges as well as opportunities. Pharmaceutical companies that had originally abandoned the research project began expressing interest in reacquiring access to the technology they had walked away from years earlier. Government agencies from other countries inquired about purchasing or licensing the equipment for their own medical programs. Private investors offered enormous sums for partial ownership of the facility and its technological capabilities. Marcus found himself fielding offers that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination while also receiving subtle pressure from organizations that preferred persuasion to negotiation. Dr. Winters warned him that the international medical technology market was highly competitive and that some players were willing to use unethical methods to acquire valuable innovations. Security became a consideration that Marcus had never anticipated, with experts advising protective measures for both the facility and his family. The transformation of their lives had progressed far beyond what Marcus had imagined when he first discovered the equipment in St. Helena's basement. What had begun as a search for financial stability had evolved into a project that could influence the future of medical care globally. The abandoned hospital had awakened from its 12-year slumber to become the center of innovations that attracted attention from around the world. Lily seemed to understand intuitively that their lives had changed in ways that extended beyond their new house and her new school. She asked thoughtful questions about the hospital's purpose and listened carefully to Marcus's explanations about helping sick people with special machines. Her acceptance of their transformed circumstances reflected a wisdom that suggested she grasped the importance of what they were undertaking, even if she couldn't fully comprehend its complexity. The final regulatory approvals came through on a Friday afternoon in late autumn, delivered by phone calls that Marcus received while standing in the hospital's restored lobby. Dr. Winters was there as well, along with several members of the medical team who had been preparing for this moment for months. The building that had been empty and forgotten for 12 years was officially authorized to resume its mission of healing and medical innovation. As they walked through corridors that would soon be filled with patients and researchers, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The eviction notice was still tucked away somewhere among his papers, a reminder of how desperate his situation had been just months earlier. Now he was the administrator of a medical facility that possessed a technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars and the potential to revolutionize healthcare delivery. But the most meaningful change wasn't financial or professional. It was the sense of purpose that came from being part of something larger than his individual circumstances. The abandoned hospital had been waiting for someone to recognize its potential and commit to realizing its promise. Marcus had inherited much more than a building and equipment. He had inherited the responsibility to ensure that medical advances developed in secret could be shared with a world that needed them desperately. The laughter from his former neighbors had long since faded, replaced by respectful attention from medical professionals, government officials, and community members who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus Chen was no longer the struggling single father who couldn't afford to fix his apartment's leaking ceiling. He had become the guardian of medical innovations that could change countless lives, and he was finally ready to prove that sometimes the most unlikely people are chosen for the most important responsibilities. The first patient arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with destiny. Maria Castellanos had traveled from Guatemala with her 12-year-old son Diego, who suffered from a rare neurological condition that had been progressing despite treatment at 3 different medical centers. Dr. Winters had been contacted by a colleague who remembered the research conducted at St. Helena's years earlier, specifically studies involving experimental treatments for degenerative brain disorders that had shown remarkable success before the program's abrupt termination. Marcus stood in the hospital's main lobby as Maria and Diego entered through doors that had been sealed for over a decade, watching as the mother's eyes took in the gleaming equipment and restored corridors with a mixture of hope and desperation that made his chest tighten. Diego moved with the careful gait of someone whose body no longer obeyed commands with reliability, his left hand trembling slightly as he gripped his mother's arm for support. The 12-year-old's eyes held an intelligence that seemed older than his years, the kind of premature wisdom that comes from understanding mortality long before childhood should end. Dr. Winters emerged from the elevator, wearing the crisp white coat that had been cleaned and pressed for this moment. Her silver hair pulled back in the professional style that signaled the return of St. Helena's medical authority. She greeted Maria in fluent Spanish, her voice carrying the kind of gentle confidence that had made her legendary among patients during the hospital's previous incarnation. Diego responded to her questions with shy politeness, answering inquiries about his symptoms while stealing glances at the advanced diagnostic equipment that lined the corridors like sentinels of technological hope. The examination process took place in a suite that had been specifically designed for the experimental neurological treatments developed during the hospital's secret research years. Marcus watched through observation windows as machines worth millions of dollars performed scans that revealed Diego's condition with unprecedented clarity, mapping the progression of his disease in three-dimensional detail that made current medical imaging look primitive by comparison. The results appeared on monitors that Dr. Winters studied with the focused intensity of someone reading prophecies that could determine a child's future. What they discovered exceeded even the most optimistic projections from the original research data. Diego's condition was precisely the type that the experimental treatments had been designed to address, and his age placed him in the optimal range for intervention. The neurological damage was extensive but not irreversible, and the specific protein markers indicated he would likely respond well to the therapeutic protocols that had been developed and tested during St. Helena's research period. For the first time since Maria had learned of her son's diagnosis, there was genuine reason for hope. The treatment itself required technology that existed nowhere else in the world, devices that had been perfected during the secret research program but never manufactured for general medical use. Marcus found himself learning about targeted gene therapy delivery systems, microscopic robots that could repair cellular damage at the molecular level, and electromagnetic field generators that could stimulate neural regeneration in ways that seemed like science fiction. The equipment operated with precision that surpassed human capability, guided by artificial intelligence programs that had been trained on decades of neurological research data. Dr. Winters explained each step of the treatment process to Maria, with the patience of someone who understood that comprehension was as important as consent. The procedures would be conducted over several weeks, with Diego staying at the hospital during treatment periods and returning home between sessions. The protocols had been tested extensively during the original research program, showing success rates that exceeded 90% for patients with similar conditions. But Maria would be trusting her son's life to experimental technology that had been locked away for 12 years. The decision was made with the quiet courage that mothers summon when faced with impossible choices. Maria signed consent forms that acknowledged both the extraordinary potential benefits and the inherent risks of experimental treatment, her signature committing her son to procedures that represented the cutting edge of medical science. Diego seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, asking thoughtful questions about the treatment process and expressing excitement about being part of something that could help other children with similar conditions. The first treatment session took place in a chamber that looked like something from a distant future, its walls lined with equipment that hummed with barely audible power. Diego lay on a table surrounded by devices that mapped his neural activity in real time, while delivering targeted therapy to damaged areas of his brain. Marcus watched from the control room as Dr. Winters monitored readings that showed the treatment working exactly as the research data had predicted, cellular repair processes activating and neural pathways beginning to regenerate. The improvement was visible within hours. Diego's hand tremor diminished noticeably, and his gait became more stable as he walked through the hospital corridors. By the end of the first week, he was moving with confidence that had been absent for months, his motor control returning as damaged neural connections were restored by the molecular-level interventions. Maria wept with relief and gratitude, her tears reflecting the transformation that was occurring not just in her son, but in the entire purpose of the restored hospital. Word of Diego's successful treatment spread through medical networks with the speed that revolutionary breakthroughs always generate among professionals who dedicate their lives to healing. Physicians from major medical centers requested information about the protocols, while researchers sought access to equipment that could advance their own work by decades. St. Helena's Medical Center was receiving inquiries from around the world, with patients and doctors eager to explore treatment options that had previously existed only in theoretical research papers. But success brought complications that Marcus had not anticipated. Pharmaceutical companies that had walked away from the original research project began demanding access to the treatment protocols, claiming intellectual property rights based on their initial investment in the consortium. Government agencies from multiple countries expressed interest in the technology for their national healthcare systems, some offering partnership agreements, while others hinted at more coercive alternatives if cooperation was not forthcoming. The pressure intensified when Diego's case was featured in a medical journal article that Dr. Winters published describing the successful treatment of previously incurable neurological conditions. The publication triggered international attention that brought both opportunities and threats to St. Helena's peaceful restoration efforts. Representatives from global healthcare corporations arrived in Millbrook Valley with proposals that ranged from generous to predatory, all seeking some form of control over technology that could revolutionize treatment for millions of patients. Marcus found himself negotiating with executives whose net worth exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations, while also fielding pressure from government officials who spoke in diplomatic language that barely concealed ultimatums. The abandoned hospital that had once been forgotten by the world now attracted attention from organizations capable of making his life very difficult if he refused to cooperate with their demands. Dr. Winters warned him that several inquiries had come from entities with connections to intelligence agencies that viewed medical technology as potential national security assets. The solution came from an unexpected source when Helena called with news that would change everything. Her veterinarian husband had been contacted by colleagues who were researching the same neurological conditions that affected both humans and animals, and they had learned about the breakthrough treatments being conducted at St. Helena's. But more importantly, they had connected Marcus's work to a network of independent medical researchers who were developing strategies for protecting innovative treatments from corporate acquisition and government appropriation. The network operated through a system of partnerships between small hospitals, research universities, and private foundations that pooled resources to develop and distribute medical advances without surrendering control to large corporations. They offered St. Helena's membership in a consortium that would provide legal protection, funding support, and collaborative research opportunities, while ensuring that breakthrough treatments remained accessible to patients regardless of their ability to pay. The proposal represented everything that Marcus had hoped for when he first decided to restore the hospital. Dr. Winters embraced the partnership opportunity with enthusiasm that reflected her original vision for the research project. She had always believed that medical advances should serve humanity rather than corporate profits, and the consortium offered a way to achieve that goal while maintaining the independence that made innovative research possible. The legal framework would protect St. Helena's technology from acquisition attempts while providing mechanisms for sharing beneficial treatments with medical facilities around the world. The formal agreement was signed during a ceremony that took place in the hospital's restored conference room, with representatives from partner institutions participating via video connections that linked St. Helena's to research facilities on every continent. Marcus signed documents that established the hospital as a founding member of the Medical Innovation Cooperative, an organization dedicated to developing and distributing advanced treatments through collaborative rather than competitive models. Lily attended the signing ceremony wearing a dress that Helena had sent for the occasion, her presence serving as a reminder of the personal transformation that had accompanied the hospital's restoration. She sat beside Marcus during the formal proceedings, asking whispered questions about the importance of the documents he was signing and listening to explanations about how their work would help sick children around the world. Her understanding of the broader implications seemed remarkable for a 9-year-old, though Marcus suspected she was developing wisdom beyond her years through exposure to work that mattered more than profit margins. The immediate impact of the consortium membership was profound. Funding flowed into St. Helena's research programs from sources that valued innovation over ownership, allowing Dr. Winters to expand treatment protocols and develop new therapeutic approaches. Medical professionals from partner institutions arrived to participate in collaborative projects, bringing expertise that complemented the advanced equipment and creating a research environment that exceeded anything achieved during the original secret program. More patients began arriving as word spread through medical networks about treatments that were available nowhere else in the world. A concert pianist whose career had been ended by nerve damage regained full use of her hands through procedures that repaired cellular destruction at the molecular level. A construction worker paralyzed in an industrial accident walked out of the hospital after treatments that regenerated spinal cord connections previously thought to be permanently severed. Each success story generated additional interest from patients and medical professionals who recognized they were witnessing revolutionary advances in healing capabilities. The transformation of Millbrook Valley reflected the hospital's return to prominence within the community. Property values increased as medical professionals moved to the area, attracted by opportunities to work with technology that represented the future of healthcare. Local businesses expanded to serve the growing population of researchers, patients, and families who came to St. Helena's for treatments unavailable elsewhere. The town that had struggled economically since the hospital's closure was experiencing a renaissance driven by medical innovation and collaborative research. Marcus found himself invited to speak at medical conferences around the world, sharing the story of how an abandoned hospital had been transformed into a center for breakthrough treatments. Through community effort and collaborative vision, his presentations focused on the importance of preserving medical advances for humanitarian purposes rather than allowing them to be controlled by organizations that prioritized profits over patients. The response was overwhelmingly positive from audiences who understood that healthcare innovation required protection from corporate predators. But the most meaningful recognition came from patients whose lives had been saved or dramatically improved through treatments that existed only because Marcus had chosen to restore rather than liquidate his inheritance. Letters arrived daily from families expressing gratitude for giving them hope when conventional medicine had offered only palliative care. Children drew pictures of the hospital as a castle where magical healing occurred, while parents wrote emotional testimonials about miracles that had seemed impossible until they experienced them personally. Diego returned for his final treatment session on a spring morning that felt like a celebration of renewal. His recovery had been so complete that casual observers would never suspect he had once faced a terminal diagnosis, his movements fluid and confident as he walked through corridors where his healing journey had begun. Maria accompanied him with tears of joy that reflected the transformation of their entire future, their lives forever changed by access to technology that had been gathering dust in basement storage rooms. Dr. Winters conducted Diego's final examination with the satisfaction of someone who had devoted her career to moments like this, watching as diagnostic equipment confirmed that his neurological function had been restored to completely normal levels. The experimental treatments had not only halted the progression of his disease, but had actually reversed damage that conventional medicine considered irreversible. His case would be documented in medical literature as proof that conditions previously thought incurable could be defeated through innovative approaches and advanced technology. The celebration dinner that evening took place in the hospital's cafeteria, transformed for the occasion into a gathering place where medical staff, patients, families, and community members shared stories of the facility's impact on their lives. Marcus sat with Lily and Diego, watching as the two children discussed the science behind the treatments with the enthusiasm that kids usually reserve for video games or sports. Their friendship had developed during Diego's treatment period, bonding over shared curiosity about how the medical equipment worked, and dreams of possibly becoming doctors themselves someday. Helena arrived for the celebration with her family, finally seeing in person the transformation that Marcus had described in their phone conversations. She toured the facility with amazement that reflected her difficulty in reconciling the cutting-edge research center with her memories of her brother's desperate circumstances just 2 years earlier. Her children were fascinated by the advanced technology and asked detailed questions about how machines could repair people's bodies at the cellular level, their scientific curiosity encouraged by explanations that made complex procedures understandable to young minds. The evening's highlight came when Dr. Winters presented Marcus with a framed photograph of the hospital's original research team, taken during the secret program's most productive period. She had kept the picture for 12 years, waiting for the right moment to share it with someone who would understand its significance. The faces in the photograph showed dedication and excitement that reflected their belief in work that could change the world, expressions that Marcus recognized in the current staff who had restored that revolutionary vision. But the most profound moment occurred when Maria approached Marcus with Diego by her side, the boy carrying a handwritten letter expressing gratitude in 3 languages for the opportunity to experience a normal childhood. His letter described dreams of becoming a neurosurgeon, so he could use the same technology that had saved his life to help other children facing similar challenges. The circle of healing was expanding beyond individual patients to include future medical professionals who would carry forward the innovations they had personally experienced. The formal ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new plaque beside the hospital's main entrance, recognizing St. Helena's Medical Center as a founding member of the Medical Innovation Cooperative and dedicating the facility to the memory of Marcus Chen, whose vision had made everything possible. Marcus placed his hand on Lily's shoulder as they read the inscription together, understanding that they were part of something that would continue long after their own involvement ended. Late that evening, after the guests had departed and the hospital had returned to its usual quiet efficiency, Marcus walked through corridors that hummed with purpose and possibility. The abandoned building that had once seemed like a cruel joke had become a center for healing that attracted attention from around the world. The basement storage rooms that had held forgotten equipment now supplied technology that was saving lives and advancing medical science. The inheritance that had prompted laughter from neighbors had transformed into a legacy that would benefit humanity for generations. Lily found him in his office, where he often worked late into the evening coordinating research projects and treatment protocols that required constant attention. She climbed into the chair beside his desk and asked questions about the day's events, particularly about Diego's recovery and whether other children with similar conditions would be able to receive the same treatments. Her concerns reflected a growing understanding of the broader implications of their work and a desire to ensure that healing opportunities were available to everyone who needed them. Marcus explained how the consortium partnership was already enabling other hospitals to access the breakthrough treatments, with training programs being developed to teach medical professionals around the world how to use the advanced protocols. St. Helena's was becoming the center of a network that would eventually bring revolutionary treatments to patients regardless of their location or economic circumstances. The abandoned hospital had awakened not just to serve its local community, but to transform healthcare delivery globally. The conversation was interrupted by a call from a colleague in Geneva, where the World Health Organization was considering adopting protocols developed at St. Helena's as standard treatments for previously incurable conditions. The recognition represented validation of everything they had accomplished, but more importantly, it meant that millions of patients would eventually benefit from innovations that had nearly been lost to corporate abandonment and bureaucratic indifference. As Marcus tucked Lily into bed in their house that overlooked the hospital, she asked one final question that captured the essence of their transformed lives. She wanted to know if the people who had laughed at them for inheriting an abandoned hospital understood now that some gifts are too important to judge by their initial appearance. Marcus smiled as he explained that sometimes the most valuable treasures come disguised as problems, and that the greatest adventures begin when people are brave enough to see possibilities that others miss. The hospital's lights twinkled in the darkness below their window, each illuminated room representing someone whose life was being touched by technology that had waited 12 years for the right person to recognize its potential. Marcus Chen had inherited much more than a building and equipment. He had been entrusted with innovations that could revolutionize healing for generations to come. The poor single father who had been mocked for receiving an abandoned hospital had become the guardian of medical advances that would change the world. The story that had begun with laughter and ended with miraculous healing served as proof that sometimes the universe's greatest gifts arrive when they are needed most, wrapped in packages that only the wise recognize as treasures. Marcus fell asleep, listening to the quiet sounds of a hospital that never truly slept, where researchers worked through the night, developing treatments that would save lives, and where patients rested, knowing they had access to healing that existed nowhere else on Earth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more patients seeking revolutionary treatments, and continued pressure from organizations that wanted to control technology they had once abandoned. But tonight, St. Helena's Medical Center stood as a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed proof that innovation could serve humanity rather than corporate interests, and that sometimes the most unlikely people are chosen to protect the most important discoveries. The abandoned hospital had kept its secrets for 12 years, waiting for someone with the vision to see beyond surface appearances and the courage to commit everything to realizing forgotten dreams. Marcus Chen had inherited that opportunity and transformed it into a legacy that would heal countless lives, while proving that true wealth comes from service to others rather than personal accumulation. The laughter that had once echoed through his neighborhood had been replaced by grateful tears from families whose children would grow up healthy because one man had been brave enough to see treasure where others saw only abandonment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.